This is Michael Sunleitner. Uh, I am helping to teach a course on Gandhi and King, Soul Force and Social Change. This is the beginning of our 9th week of the course. Next week will be our last 3 sessions. Today, King's impacts through history, Cesar Chavez and others. Partial, if you could put up the first slide relating to King's impacts. I want to be true to our course syllabus. And of course, those of you who are watching this recording or who are present with us in person, if you like, can expand this slide, screenshot it, and keep it for your future reference. I don't want to spend too much time with it because it is mostly relating to people and the past. King's impacts, of course, have been dramatically profound in the United States. We are no longer a by law segregated society. Major national laws have been passed, the 1964 Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and others. And so tremendous changes happened, laying the foundation, of course, for the election of the first president of the United States of African American heritage, Barack Obama. Let us look briefly at these people, because I want to go on to look at voting rights in the United States today and how these have been compromised, particularly in the last 15 years. Cesar Chavez was, as you can see here, a person who was active with the United Farm Workers and organizing labor unions among farm workers, particularly California. He became famous for his boycotts, his civil disobedience campaigns, and he was inspired by Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Please take note of his name. You can read what I wrote about him briefly, but study him on your own. John Lewis is a second person who left this world in 2020. He was the leader of the Voter Education Project in the South, risked his life many, many times, and was a key part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed. He was beaten almost to death on the Pettus Bridge during the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. These are events that we have mentioned in previous class periods. John Lewis was interviewed by me as part of my research on Martin Luther King. I didn't know him as a U.S. congressperson, but he served for many years from Georgia in the U.S. Congress and advocated for a new advancement of voting rights, which was never passed. Jesse Jackson still lives. He is suffering from Parkinson's disease, and so he is not so much in the public eye anymore. But he was on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, when Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was a very young man at that time, and later went on to seek the Democratic Party nomination for president twice. Learn about Jesse Jackson. Most of you have heard of Barack Obama. Certainly Barack Obama would not have been president except for the expanding voting rights for African Americans following the law of 1965. I could mention so many other people, but here is a person I want you all to be aware of if you have never heard of her before. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. In the United States, she's known as AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She is a young woman, by my standards. I think she is now 35 years old. As you can see here, she's a Boston University graduate. Boston University is where Martin Luther King got his PhD. She had honors in economics and international relations. She worked as a bartender serving drinks in New York City, in the Bronx area, and eventually decided, I'm going to run for the U.S. House of Representatives. And she ran in 2018 against a Democrat in the primary, who was a 10-term Democrat. He had been an elected representative for 20 years. And this young woman ran against him and won the Democratic nomination. She has become famous in the United States because she is so exceptionally well-spoken. Please, please, if you will, look on YouTube or elsewhere for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and listen to what she has to say. I think you will find the spirit of Martin Luther King very much in her. She doesn't refer to him very much, but she is on the left wing of the Democratic Party. And Dr. King, of course, we learned, was associated with the Democratic Party, but also on the left wing, and would privately call himself a democratic socialist. AOC publicly calls herself a democratic socialist, and at this moment, this week, she is touring with U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders throughout the United States on the Fighting Oligarchy tour. Fighting oligarchy, fighting rule by the wealthy. This week in Denver, Colorado, the two of them had a crowd of 30,000 people. They are trying, in the spirit of Martin Luther King, to get the Democratic Party to stand up against Donald Trump and his policies. And frankly, if anyone can make a difference in this regards, I think it will be AOC and Bernie Sanders. At this point, I don't want to spend too much more time on people that have been impacted by Martin Luther King. Probably everyone who is watching this recording or attending class today have been impacted, including myself. I don't want to devote our entire session to that, but I did want you to be seeing several names that you can do further research on. And I might once again add the name that I have mentioned to you many times before, Bayard Rustin. What would Gandhi be doing? What would King be doing today if he were living? Among other things, I think he would be fighting for the rights of homosexual and other people of diverse backgrounds. His friend Bayard Rustin was gay, and Bayard Rustin was the architect of the organizing of the March on Washington in 1963. Bayard Rustin is no longer with us in this world, but as Donald Trump actively attacks people of gay, lesbian, bigender, bisexual, and other non-mainstream backgrounds, the spirit of Bayard Rustin and the spirit of Martin Luther King, I believe, needs to be with us. Is there anything that anyone would like to ask about these people before we move on to looking at U.S. voting rights and how these have been compromised in recent years? Lubna, you have a green circle around you. Would you like to speak?
No, I did not notice that. Maybe Somehow I have my hands has placed. No, I'm listening to you carefully.
Well, thank you for that, but also, as always, feel free to speak up. Sophie, I know you are always thinking, and if you have things you want to say, everyone will benefit from you. By the way, as I look at my screen and I see many of you have arrived, please make note that Sibby Joseph, of course, is with us, and a special guest to this class today, Prasad, is with us from Hyderabad. He is currently the managing trustee at the Gandhi King Foundation in Hyderabad. Professor Prasad will be teaching our course this time next week. He will be our guest speaker. But he wanted to attend the class to see what we are doing before he becomes the guest speaker next week. Welcome, Prasad.
Thank you.
Again, is there anything anyone would like to ask about people associated with King that have had an impact? Hearing no one at this point speak, feel free to unmute and ask questions as we move along. Harshal, you, of course, are reading my mind, a very dangerous thing to be doing. You have a second posting, U.S. voting rights and suppression. Once again, feel free to look at this with care, screenshot it, and make use of it for future study if you like. We remember the Selma to Montgomery March of 1965, where John Lewis was nearly killed by state troopers on horseback while he was crossing, with many others, the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The Voting Rights Act was passed in August of that year. Remember the three major components. This incredible law prohibited states from imposing qualifications or practices to deny the right to vote based on race. Second, it allowed direct federal government intervention in state and local elections with a history of discrimination. In other words, U.S. federal armed marshals could be sent to state areas where people were not allowed to register to vote. And they could physically require the local officials to allow the registrations to take place. This was perhaps the greatest law in 100 years when it came to the rights of African Americans in the United States. Notice the third part of the law. It required prior federal government approval of new laws to assure that they would be non-discriminatory in impact. In other words, if Alabama, a state with a long, long history of discriminating against Black people and refusing to allow them to register, if Alabama wanted to create a new law, the national government had to review it first. It's called pre-approval before the law could go into effect, because Alabama had such a very long history of discriminating against Blacks. So this was one of the major accomplishments of Martin Luther King, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And for over 20 years, it had a very positive impact. A great many people were able to vote who were not allowed to before. And again, this allowed Barack Obama to be elected president. In 2006, the 1965 law was renewed by the Congress, which is the legislative branch of the United States. And so it is set to expire in 2031. So the 65 law is still in effect. But is it? Notice here a 2013 US Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court that has 9 unelected judges, they are appointed for life. We can discuss the process whereby judges are selected in the United States if you like. But in 2013, in a 5-4 ruling, they said that the preclearance portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is unconstitutional. What does that mean? It means the law that we just discussed, Part 3 of that law, which required pre-approval of new voting rights requirements, that cannot happen anymore. In 2013, the US Supreme Court said, you can't do that. There is no more federal approval of state laws. States, you can do what you want. We don't need to fight racism anymore in elections. States can do what they want. Well, they did. Between 2013 and 2025, during those 12 years, 31 states passed 115 restricting voting laws, including 44 laws that were previously required to be approved by the federal government, the preclearance laws. Everything was good. The Supreme Court had allowed the floodgates to be opened, and now people who wanted to creatively restrict voting rights could do so. That was the 2013 Supreme Court decision. What did the states do? Here I list a number of the things that the states did during those 12 years. They cleaned election records. Well, that sounds okay. Don't you think we should clean a little bit sometimes? Yes, but what this did, many states did, was say, if you have not voted according to the records in 2 elections, we will throw you off the record books and you will have to re-register if you want to vote. That was cleaning the election records. Well, let us just say you can see that relatively poor people and non-white people tend to vote in lower numbers than others in the United States. And if they had not voted in 2 election years, they were then thrown off and were not yet any more eligible to vote. These people are people who usually, if they do vote Democrat. So cleaning the election records in a state like Florida effectively gave great advantages to the Republican Party. A second thing that was done was they began using electronic voting machines. Well, that is, of course, just using technology to help make the system more efficient. An issue, though, with these machines in places like Florida is that there is no paper trail. There is no record kept of the original ballot that is marked by the people who are voting. And so with only the electronic record of the vote, the danger is it can be hacked. People who are familiar with technology can hack into the voting results and change the results. There was widespread problems with this in the 1980s and even more recently. And we cannot tell for sure whether the voting record has been changed because we have no paper ballot to compare it with. I'm mentioning these things not only to help you understand problems in the US, but you in your countries may also have similar problems. In India, in the Gambia, in France. If you don't have paper trail with your electronic voting machines, you could have elections stolen. There was also a process where they would reduce the number of voting booths and where they were placed and how the hours that you could be voting. This is kind of sounds very non-important, but in a state like Ohio, for example, where Republicans controlled the Secretary of State's office that controls the elections. In the state of Ohio, the Republican Party reduced the number of places that people could vote at. They reduced the number of machines that would be at certain places where African American voters were larger in number. And they would also reduce the hours that were available for you to go and vote. So in Ohio, for example, in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected the first time, white voting areas in Ohio would have very short lines, and white voters would be able to vote very easily. Black areas would have huge, long lines where people would have to wait sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours to vote because there were fewer machines in those areas. And some people were not able to vote at all because the voting time of day finished and they were still in line, unable to vote. This is called voter suppression. There was also widespread challenging of ballots that were cast. What does that mean? It means that there would be Republican and other observers at a voting place, and they would say to someone like Lubna, Lubna, you are not on our voter registration rolls. You cannot vote. And Lubna would say,
Yes.
but I have long registered to vote in Florida. What do you mean? Well, they would say, you are not registered. You've been thrown off. Well, that could be because of cleaning of the records. It could be that someone with Lubna's same name might have been disqualified. But the point is, it's unusual to have people at the voting booths challenging anyone's right to vote. And Lubna is just an example because I can see her on my phone.
But
But
when they keep the registration, don't they have the documents with them? That I have the documents with me. How come it is not registered right now?
you can
Hard
have
copies.
a registration card with you, yes.
Yes.
But the people at the voting place can say, your registration card is no longer valid. You are not on my list of registered voters. It might be that you were purged or you were cleaned off of the records. In any case, thousands of people in Florida were challenged almost all of them non-white.
Yeah.
And they were then unable to vote.
Yeah, meticulously designed.
Yes, so you can see how since the 2013 Supreme Court decision, conservative Republicans have been very, very clever in trying to change the rules, making it more difficult for non-white people and for poor people to vote, full knowing that non-white people and poor people are more likely to vote Democrat. It's extremely political and it is racist.
Can I ask, how did it come to the 2013 Supreme Court decision? Like, who put that in place? Was it like someone of the Republican Party, or like how did it come up for the Supreme Court to take a decision?
Well, put very briefly, because I've taught entire courses on constitutional law and the judicial system in the United States. But basically, you have to have one or more people bring a case saying, we believe that part of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. And if they lose at the lower court levels in the United States, it can be appealed and appealed up to the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court, since 1921, has been given the choice to decide what court cases it will hear. They don't have to hear every case. 4 of the 9 judges on the Supreme Court need to want to hear a case for it to be actually appealed and heard by them. In this case, in the Shelby case, the Supreme Court had recently become majority Republican. And 3 of the 9 judges were Trump appointees. And so they chose to hear that appeal, and they heard the arguments, but they chose to hear it because they knew they had a 5-4 majority and they could overrule a key element of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it was a political action on the part of the US Supreme Court. I hope that answers your good question, Sophie. It is very disturbing to me. Yes.
Good evening.
Yes, good evening. Malugi?
Yes, I want to understand how would that impact the future of the court rulings or court proceedings in America, because if I understand, you were saying it's impacted by political things by Trump, the 1965 law. So how would that impact the future process? Thank you.
Well, it very clearly can impact. The Shelby case is only one example. When you have now 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats on the Supreme Court of 9 judges, it's not a guarantee that every case will be ruled upon in favor of the Republicans, but it's a fair bet. And please understand that these 9 judges under the US Constitution only have to be human beings that are alive. They have no qualifications. There is no age qualification, no education qualification. They don't have to be lawyers even. They are political appointments. They are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed or rejected by the US Senate, 100 people, 2 from each state. And if the president is a Republican and the Senate is controlled by Republicans, as they are now, if someone dies or resigns from the Supreme Court tomorrow, Mr. Trump can nominate a new person, and the Republicans in the Senate can confirm that new person. And maybe a 6-3 Republican majority will become 7-2. It is a political institution. Most of the judges do have law backgrounds. Most of the judges at least appear to have qualifications, even though none are required. There is, of course, the appearance that the Supreme Court rules objectively and in the common good. That is the common tradition. But many of the decisions are very, very partisan and very, very political. Mafugi, I'm sure you find that disturbing, as I also am not happy with it.
Quite true. I don't understand why there has to be a qualification. I don't know why America, I'm not sure. It should be a cultural profession. One should have.
Well, the U.S. Constitution was proposed back in 1789. In 1789, of the roughly 3.5 million people in the original 13 states, very few were college graduates. Very few were highly educated. And so the original document, the U.S. Constitution, does not put qualifications down for judges. It was for the people to decide who the judges would be. And the Supreme Court qualifications have not changed in over 200 years. There are no qualifications. It's a political appointment. I'm hoping that some of you find this interesting. I don't want you to be bored. That is one reason why I also wanted to inform you of a practice historically called gerrymandering. If you see the handout that I gave you, you can see that how gerrymander is spelled on the slide. It is named after a former governor of the state of Massachusetts who, in 1812, approved a very odd-shaped district in Boston that looked like a salamander. A salamander is a kind of lizard that is often found in little lakes and marshy areas. It's a very strange drawn district. There are 2 types of drawing of election districts and in the United States. You can have a gerrymander by cracking. That is called a process where you exclude a targeted group from being represented. You simply draw the district in such a way that people, perhaps Black people, will not have a large enough number of voters in that district to elect anyone. You just draw it so it's a white district. Or you can draw it so that it's a Democratic Party district and Republicans have no chance. You can draw a district in any shape you want if it's a gerrymander. You can also pack a gerrymander, and that's a way of minimizing voter power to create a lower representation for a targeted group. Let's see, Harshal, do you have that picture of the state of Oregon that I provided to you before?
Yes, I put on it.
This is a good example of a packing gerrymander. If you perhaps expand that picture of my state, of Oregon, you can see that my state, it looks kind of like a box. The northern boundary is a river called the Columbia River. Where I live is in the northwest portion, in the area that kind of looks like light blue. That's district number 1, is where I live. If you look at these districts, there are 6. That's because we have 6 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Members of the House of Representatives have about 150,000 voters in each district. So the people who draw the districts can draw them any way they want. They're drawn typically after a census, which is every 10 years. So in the year 2020, for example, Democrats controlled my state of Oregon in the state legislature. The state legislature drew these 6 boundaries, these 6 districts, so there are about the same number of voters in each district. And these will go to Washington, D.C. to represent us in the House of Representatives. District 2 is a very rural area covering most of eastern Oregon, and it is Republican. It's very rural, much more farming, very few big cities, and these typically are conservative Republican voters. In District 2, Republicans almost certainly will win. But in districts 1, 3, 4, and 6, those districts were drawn by Democrats so that Democrats would win. District 4, you can see, is a little bit of a strange shape. It's kind of a packing gerrymander where they made sure that Democrats would win by drawing it in a way that Republicans have very few the chances of getting a majority. But look at District 5. District 5 is a very clear gerrymander. Look how strange that shape is. District 5 was drawn by Democrats to have just enough Republicans to make it look like it's fair, but made it very likely that Democrats would win that seat, especially if there was a good voter turnout. So this is known as a partisan packing gerrymander. Democrats were packed into District 5 in a way that made it Republicans very unlikely to be able to win that seat. Now that is called, of course, a party gerrymander. But what if it was done by race? In southern states like Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, you have similar districts drawn that are to minimize Black voting impact. So Blacks who can vote, who survive all of the barriers that we were discussing before, they still may not be able to be represented in Washington, D.C. because of racial gerrymander. drawing of the district boundaries in a way to minimize the black vote. So I'm coming close to the end of my comments for the day, but I want to go back to the slide. There we are. Harshal reads my mind. You can see in this year, 2025, and in fact, this week, the US Supreme Court is reconsidering a 2013 decision. The case comes from Louisiana, and it's very likely that the US Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of a racial gerrymander in Louisiana. In other words, a drawing of election boundaries in Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, that minimize black voting power. The Republicans on the court are expected to overturn the previous decision in the Allen case and allow for the boundaries to be drawn in a very strange way to make it difficult for blacks to win a seat. This is happening just this week, being heard just now. Louisiana versus Calais. Now, be aware that while John Lewis was still living, he was trying to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 not only renewed, but expanded. In honor of his death, in 2023, the Democratic Party, which controlled the House and the Senate a little, barely, tried to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed. They failed. That particular John Lewis law, had it passed, would have reversed the 2013 Shelby case and would have completely upheld the Civil Rights Act of 1965. But in 2023, that law did not pass. The Democrats did not have the votes. And to be honest, two key Democrats voted with the Republicans to stop this law from passing. The legacy of Martin Luther King was severely harmed when the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act was defeated. We will see tomorrow when I look at how Donald Trump was elected. We will look at the 2024 election. We will see how the changes in the voting laws helped Donald Trump win the election in November of 2024. And tomorrow we will also see how Donald Trump is trying to limit voting rights even more now than has been the case even under the gerrymandering and other actions of the recent past. Tomorrow we will look at the 2024 election and current efforts to restrict voting rights. On Saturday, my plan is to look at both Narendra Modi and Donald Trump, to look at their worldview, which is very similar, and see how neither one of them are really trying to encourage democracy, but are trying to create systems where those who they believe to be the best in their society should have greater power. In the United States, that's Donald Trump trying to limit non-white people and religious minorities also, so as to give advantage to white nationalist views. And on Saturday, we will see how Narendra Modi, of course, is doing similar actions in India to try to minimize Muslim and Christian views in favor of Hindutva, an ideology that sees Hindus and other religions more indigenous to India as being the only citizens that should vote. There are similarities, and on Saturday, I will be discussing those and hoping to provoke you into understanding how serious the dangers are in this world to democracy.